Let me show you recorded. Okay, so we are now into the almost the last third of the course, and we have a class debate today, and it's going to be online. Everybody else is online, and let's begin with the material that we began to cover at the last class, which is the material on interest groups and social movements. And I should tell you, social movements, my professor once said to me that political science as a field should reinvent itself and reinvent itself to focus on social movements. And I think what he was saying is that a focus on institutions and the primary emphasis in political science as a field, which I think he finds to be disappointing. And so I've always thought about that, that we need to focus on social movements and what is a social movement and the theoretical frameworks for understanding social movements. And that's been my focus, particularly since I've been here, in terms of trying to understand social movements. And social movements, they get a bad reputation. At least they did until the second half of the 20th century, or maybe the last third of the 20th century, because when we say social movements, we think about the mass politics. We think about the mass public being mobilized to participate in politics. And when we say the mass public being mobilized to participate in politics, what images that come up, at least for people that are baby boomers or a little bit younger than me, is the experience of the mid-20th century and the rise of authoritarian populism, what we called fascism in this class, that the mass public is a sleeping giant, a sleeping dragon. And if you wake it up, if you prod it and poke it, and it will be furious and angry and produce horrible experiences like the terror of the French Revolution, and then the horrible experience of the fascist regimes in Italy and Germany, Italy under Mussolini and Germany under Hitler, and in which, as we described them earlier, they were highly polarized societies, in the sense that there was a majority of the population loved Der Fuhrer or Il Duce, or in the 20th century, the Imam in Iran. I mean, Iran in the 1980s was an authoritarian populist regime, and then there was also a large minority of the community, of the public, that despised the populist, coarse, troglodyte type aspects of the regime. And so social movements were typically associated with right-wing authoritarian populist movements. And I think social movements were redeemed as a focus of study when the New Left movements emerged after World War II that were promoting civil rights, African Americans, United States, and then of course the other New Left movements that were a focus of the United States and of course affected the rest of the world as well, like the feminist movement and the youth movement, and of course, but even the American civil rights movement, focusing on African Americans, had a big impact in ways that were not expected, and became, you could say, unfortunate. For example, in Northern Ireland, I mean, the standard claim that I've come across in the media, in the scholarship, is that the Catholics in Northern Ireland were systematically oppressed and stereotyped and oppressed as backward threats to the core culture dominating Northern Ireland. And the Catholic the Catholic working class in Northern Ireland learned from the social movements of the civil rights movement in the United States, the civil disobedience movement, to begin to protest against their systematic exclusion and marginalization by the Protestant majority in Northern Ireland. And then during protests that in which security forces from the British Army were called in to help the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which was the Northern Ireland police, to confront protesters. Of course, emotions got out of hand. Somebody did something, and it was 50 years ago in 1972. There was a Sunday march, and the British military units that were there assisting the Royal Ulster Constabulary fired their weapons on the protesters and killed a number of protesters in Northern Ireland. And this was called Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday. And this killing of Catholic protesters in Northern Ireland by British Army, by British soldiers, intensified the conflict and really accelerated the rise of violence in Northern Ireland that would continue for the next 25 years, 25, 26 years, largely ending in the end of the 1990s, after 3,500 people had been killed on the Protestant and Unionist and the Catholic nationalist side in Northern Ireland. And so even those new left movements, those new left social movements that we focus on as the more positive, progressive side of social movements, they have also some impact on the development of conflicts in opposition to social oppression that, with the reaction of the authorities being poorly planned or poorly equipped to deal with those challenges, can lead to the intensification of peaceful protest into violent protest. And this is a feature of protest movements. The people protest peacefully. They try to disrupt society. They try to disrupt the status quo. They disrupt business practices. They disrupt economic activity. And of course, this makes other people very unhappy. And then when the authorities call in the police and the coercive apparatus, who are not trained or prepared to deal with these challenges effectively, they can make them worse. And these nonviolent social movements can become violent social movements. And so social movements have a lot of different drives and motivations. They include, of course, the most powerful motivation includes nationalism. I mean, challenging the British Empire or the French Empire or the Japanese Empire. For example, in Korea, at the beginning of March, I think March 1st every year is the March 1st independence movement, which was a nonviolent social protest movement in 1919 to demand or protest against the Japanese imperial occupation of Korea. And it was a nonviolent protest movement, and the Japanese imperial occupiers responded with deadly force, killed and tortured thousands of people. And the response, of course, was to make the conflicts even more intense as a result. And so there's another example of social movements producing a reaction from the authorities that then makes the conflicts that led to the movement even more intense, and the stereotyping and emotion that associate with intense conflict become more prominent, leading to social competition, zero-sum relationships, viewing the relationship between the oppressed minority and the superior majority as one of zero-sum competition, that changing the status quo risks undermining the status and position of the core group dominating the state. And and that is what you want to avoid emerging as the prevailing image or sense within the majority of the population, typically the majority that associates with the state, that identifies with the state, that ideally you don't want a situation in which they view the demands of the oppressed minority, whether it be Irish Catholics or African Americans, as threatening and undermining the status of the ruling class, of the ruling authorities. And that is, of course, not just a historical question. I think it's a dominant issue in the United States today. As I follow the political conflicts underway in the United States and the rise of Donald Trump and his likely declaration to run for president again, it's really hard to underestimate the importance of black versus white conflict in the United States. I was just thinking about that over the last couple of days in the light of our course material and what we've been covering in these classes. And I mean, it seems this is the overarching political polarization issue in the United States that emerged, of course, around after the civil rights movement of the United States that began to demand the end to Jim Crow and the racial segregation and marginalization of black and brown peoples. And that is an overriding factor driving American politics today. Even though people might not admit it to themselves, it is. That if you vote for Democratic Party of Joe Biden, you are open to or more sympathetic to the demands of black people and brown people whose demands require sacrifice at the expense of the white people. That the black and the brown people want something from the white people, and the white people will have to sacrifice and make compromises to the quality of life in their communities, in their world, in order to satisfy the illegitimate demands of black and brown people. And that's why I think, for example, in this abortion debate issue, which is now gaining world coverage and world attention, that I think that the overturning of the legal right of abortion throughout the United States, which might well happen next month, you might say that this might really cause an impact on the elections in November in the United States that would lead to the Republican Party, which is increasingly become the party of white supremacy in the United States. And I make that statement, of course, understanding and knowing that white people typically would not agree with that, because people, unlike 150 years ago, they don't openly admit to each other and to themselves that they are racist. No, they're not racists. They can point to black people that they like Clarence Thomas on the U.S. Supreme Court, or other black actors that have, as long as they speak in the terms of traditional American values, like Ben Carson, the former Housing and Urban Secretary, Department Secretary under Donald Trump, as long as they speak and act in the right way, they're not discriminated against. They claim that they dislike are people who vaguely are socialistic in their orientation, but they want the government to intervene in society to redistribute wealth and opportunity. And for if a white person in the United States or an Irish Protestant Unionist in Northern Ireland, this is seen as illegitimate, that these people want something without earning it, that they want benefits that given to them rather than earning them, that they will undermine and degrade the quality of society by their demands that we have, for example, affirmative action efforts to integrate historically marginalized racial minorities, gender minorities into American society through conscious efforts to give those people opportunities that they never were allowed to have in the past because of their race and their gender. So social movements are directly related. Studying social movements is directly related to addressing these prevailing institutionalized images that are typically unconscious or just assumed to be in place in the minds of individuals and groups within society. and changing those prevailing images that dominate the policymaking process within these societies. But whenever people tend to assume that what exists is right, what they learned and habitually accept as the nature of reality is the correct nature of reality. What exists is morally and ethically just. So if you're going to try to change people's thinking and say that Black people or gay people, for example, should be allowed to teach in schools and not hide their sexuality, that is just, for many people, that's just completely outlandish. Or to allow gay people to marry each other, men to marry other men and women to marry other women. This is considered to be outrageous against common practice that supposedly has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So social movements aim to change policies, but they're also aiming ultimately and reflecting as well the fundamentally changing constellation of attitudes and values that exist within society as a consequence of many factors and trends at work to change society, including the fact that societies have become more prosperous, societies have become more secure, particularly since the Second World War, right? That there's been tremendous growth in the wealth of at least of the Northern Hemisphere countries, North America, Europe, and Asia, Northern Asia. There's been a tremendous increase in the level of education in these societies. So it was only, for example, in 1970 that half of the adult population in the United States, which at that time was a leader in education, 52 years ago, the United States was a leader in global education. Only in 1970 did 50% of the adults in the United States have a high school graduation diploma. Only half. So the other 50% had less than a high school education without graduation diploma. I was 8 years old in 1970. I remember 1970. So America of 1970 must have been very, very different from America of 1920, let us say. So these changing levels of prosperity and security and education, and with the development of technology, let's not forget technology, right? Beginning in the 1920s, we have radio, national radio program. So for the first time, we have an immediate broadcast media available for everybody to hear who has a radio. And remember, you had to have money to buy a radio, to hear up-to-date news that is happening in the very same week that it's being broadcast on the radio. Previously, the only other available source of news was the newspaper, right? So you had to be able to read. If you were illiterate, obviously you can't read the newspaper. Somebody else who can read might read it for you. But then with the emergence of radio in the 1920s, everybody has access to news reports, at least through the radio. And then, of course, later, also television emerges. And television only became a naturally widely available product in by the early 1960s, when I was born. And so there's a changing environment in these societies in terms of economy, technology, and also attitudes and values that reflect the impact of the social welfare state that make people more willing to consider or believe or question standard assumptions. Like, you know, it was just considered normal 150 years ago that Black and white people in America should not marry. That mixing races, miscegenation was wrong. Later in the mid-20th century, this comes to change. To stay with Europe, of course, in Ireland, the Catholics of Ireland were always viewed as the way African Americans are viewed in the United States, as backward, uncivilized children who benefit from British domination, and because these Irish Catholics are considered to be childlike at best, and they're uncivilized, backward, dumb people. So marginalizing them, assuming the worst about them, that was just typical for somebody existing in the British Empire 150 years ago. Now, of course, we have different images of Ireland. Ireland was the Celtic tiger. Remember the four tigers of Asia? In the 1980s, we talked about the four tigers: Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong were the four tigers of economic development in East Asia, rapidly developing. Then in the 1980s, there was talk about the Celtic tiger. Ireland is the Celtic tiger at having high economic growth. I'm not talking about Northern Ireland, I'm talking about the Republic of Ireland, the southern part of the island. The Celtic tiger of Ireland, having growth rates of 9 or 10% a year. Ireland now is prosperous and developed. Ireland is a home for, at least on paper, for companies setting up tax haven headquarters in Ireland so that they can avoid paying high taxes, because Ireland has relatively low corporate taxation rates in the island. So Apple, for example, supposedly has a headquarters, at least legally speaking, in Ireland. And a number of companies have done that. Ireland has developed rapidly. Ireland has become a focus of immigration into the island, despite for many, many decades, many, many generations, being a source of export of immigration to America, to Canada, to Australia, to escape poverty and starvation, for example, going back to the Irish potato famine in the mid-19th century. Now, Ireland is considered to be cutting edge economically, a country cutting edge in terms of its economy, in terms of its future. And that plays a critical role in explaining why interaction between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is less fraught and less dangerous today than it was 50 years ago. And people in Ireland and in Great Britain and the United Kingdom and throughout Europe know what I've been telling you. Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is a modern developing society with lots of inward investment that is becoming more and more secular. They have made abortion legal. They're separating control of the Irish state from the Catholic Church. They had an openly gay prime minister from an immigrant family, was prime minister of Ireland until about, 5 years ago. Openly gay, openly homosexual. He had an Indian name, I can't remember his name. And so there have been these structural changes, environmental changes within Irish environment, the Irish community, but it takes action by human beings to bring about a formal institutional change and an institutionalization of those changes in these prevailing attitudes and values that are slowly evolving along with evolving technology, evolving society, and evolving economy. So yeah, social movements, they emerge and can be effective when there is a ripe context, a fruitful context they can exploit. And the Irish independence movement in the 1920s, coupled with the European integration of the Republic of Ireland, and of course, the British United Kingdom was part of the European Union until 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. This environment makes social movements more feasible that are not just nationalistically oriented, right? Or when they are nationalism does emerge, that the nationalism is harnessed for liberal values. Nationalism as a value that we've talked about earlier in this class, nationalism as a value can associate with conservative authoritarian values, like it did in the 1930s with fascism, or it can associate with liberal democratic values. Nationalism can associate with liberal democratic values, as we saw in the 1980s in Eastern Europe. If you're a Polish nationalist, in the late 1980s, what were you advocating? Democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. Why? Because you were ruled by an authoritarian, totalitarian, communist party imposed its rule through the threat of force from Russia, from Moscow. So, not surprisingly, the nationalist sovereignty fighters who wanted sovereignty for the Polish nation, they would talk in terms of the ideology and justify their demands in terms of the ideology of the opponent of communist totalitarianism, that is liberalism, economic and political liberalism, represented by whom? The West. And who's the leader of the West? The United States. But then, of course, after Poland and Hungary entered the European Union and the Soviet Union disappeared, disintegrated, other concerns became more prominent among Hungarian and Polish public opinion that viewed liberalism, economic and political liberalism, as a threat, increasingly as a threat to the identity and status of those sections of Polish and Hungarian society that felt that they were being disparaged or disdained in the small towns and rural countryside and small towns of Poland and Hungary in relationship to the globalizing big urban cities where you had secular, modern values being paraded and advocated as the true European values. So, and then of course, we come to where we are at the present. Now we have a new threat, or is perceived to be a threat, from Russia under Putin invading Ukraine. And Ukrainian nationalism, of course, fighting for its national sovereignty from a Russian imperialist threat, invader, is advocating its Ukrainian nationalism in terms of European values, the values of the European Union, joining European Union to defend democracy and freedom of the West and of Ukraine and of the West against this stereotype, terrible, evil, barbaric threat from Moscow. So social movements do reflect the international political environment that is changing, that exists at a particular time, that is changing over time. And so that's a theme to keep in mind, that these social movements that we associate with new left social movements, like environmental social movements and gender rights social movements and women's feminist social movements. All of these movements became more and more intense. They didn't emerge new, but they became more and more salient and more active along with the decline and collapse of the Cold War and the integration of Europe in response to the challenges of the revolutionary changes threatening the status quo in Europe in the end of the Cold War. And so, of course, social movements are one form of lobbying and pressure on the European and national governments, but we also see that other groups also lobby and pressure the national governments, including material groups, business groups that want to protect their interests, farming groups, trade unions. They're also interest groups, but social movements are a step above them, I would argue, in that social movements are sustained coalitions of interest groups that form sustained institutionalized coalitions to maintain steady contentious pressure on the state to change the status quo, at least in terms of policy and law, right? So if you pass a law that forbids gender discrimination and it requires a company to provide health daycare and maternity leave for the mother when she becomes pregnant and forbid sexual harassment at the workplace, if you, through law and policy in the form of law, you can change or begin to change prevailing societal attitudes about how women are treated in the workplace. I mean, I took a plane when I came back to Korea in February from my home in Ohio. I took a plane from the U.S., of course, to come here to Korea, and I watched movies on the flight on the flight. And one film I watched was On the Town from I think it was 1949, and it was a musical, American Hollywood musical film, quite good, quite interesting. With Frank Sinatra was in it, and Gene Kelly. And this is from 1949, so before the Korean War starts. And it was about life in New York and trying to enjoy New York in one day, because these sailors from the American Navy, they had a day off in the New York City harbor, and they had a day to be on the town in New York and sample all of what New York was like. And of course, there's one scene where they are in the subway, and they're overhearing people talking on the subway in New York in 1949, going back and forth to work. And two women are talking about how they work for a company that makes clothes, and the boss of one of the women that was talking to the other woman, they overhear their conversation, and she's describing how her boss, Mr. Godolphin, I remember his name, Mr. Godolphin, keeps trying to pressure her for a date, for romantic relations. And like, this is just totally normal. This is life in the city in 1949. This is the life of a woman. You should just accept it, because we're supposed to overhear this and go, ha, ha, ha. Oh, yeah, the boss is trying to have sex with the secretary. Oh, ha, ha, ha. Oh, life in New York. And that was how the audience was supposed to respond to this happy, funny, entertaining musical film from 1949. Now, if you do that, that's considered very bad, very wrong. You get in trouble if you do that as a boss. You get fired. So, and of course, I think Ted Turner owns Turner Classic Movies. I think he knows that's why this film was important to make available, because it's a specimen from a particular point in time. In 1949, of course, women expected, if you worked in a job somewhere, of course you should expect that a boss or some man is going to try to, beat you and maybe, maintain relations with you, keep pressuring you. That's just what it's like to be a woman in 1949 America, in New York City. We've changed a lot since then, haven't we? At least many people have changed quite a bit. And it's been changed partly through law, through regulations, that by passing policy reforms and making new laws, you send the word out, the signal out to everybody that they must change their behavior. And if they change their behavior, because they'll get in trouble if they don't change their behavior, if they change their behavior, they will change their thinking eventually. If I have to act in a certain way, I will adapt my thinking and my attitudes, in terms of my attitudes and values, to accord with and support that behavior. It might not be easy, it might not be pleasant, but it does change people's prevailing assumptions about, for example, relationships between men and women and in the workplace. And so social movements do focus on law. Social movements do focus on policy, but they focus on policy, of course, to get the benefits from the new laws and new policies, but they also focus on those laws and policies because ultimately social movements want to engage in change what's up here in terms of people's prevailing assumptions and perceptions and attitudes of what is normal, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. Attitudes and values. So if you get a chance to see this, Yeah, this is the on the town. (1949). Okay, so back to our notes, and let's see if I can recall where we stopped at our last class. So at least this professor Sauer, this professor who wrote this chapter, she argues that she's going to consider interest groups and social movements synonymous. And she's going to focus upon them being synonymous, basically the same, because she says their political behavior is pretty much the same. That even if these interest groups are focused on economic interests, they will also claim, as I said earlier, I think last class, that their economic interests are good not just for their own particular economic benefit, but somehow that their economic perfections, their economic demands, and their ideals that they're advocating for a perfect economic society in terms of what they want, they will articulate in terms of social and economic justice. See, that's the point I want to make. That even material interest groups, whether they be farmers or trade unions wanting higher wages for their workers, or even steel manufacturers or computer companies, they will advocate for what they want in terms of economic and social justice, civil and political rights justice. So farmers will talk about how they will talk about it in many different ways. What will they say? They have said that they are the keepers of the traditional culture of the society. Like, where is traditional French culture, French identity before the hubbub of the urban environment? Where is it maintained? In the countryside, right? And that's true for farmers everywhere. They are not only farmers, they are keepers of the countryside, where your great-grandparents grew up and where Italian culture emerged in the little villages and towns in these romantic images, right? Or economic interest groups, manufacturers, steel producers, whatever. What will they say? They'll say, what we want is good not just for us, it's good for the security of our country, that we need to have a strong steel industry so that we can have a strong defense, because you need the ability to manufacture steel. And this is what they talk about today, right? In the United States regarding giving companies to have protection from Chinese imports and imports from other countries, that we have to maintain the ability of American companies, for example, to make masks, because we need masks in a time of pandemic. And of course, all of our masks come from China, and that's dangerous. So we need to put up policies and import tariffs to prevent American companies from being vanquished from unfair exports from China in those countries that don't have democracy. The workers have to work as slaves of the state and who don't have to be paid a fair wage. So even interest groups that are economically motivated are going to advocate their demands in terms of economic and social justice. These broadly appealing notions of human rights, broadly understood. So I think that's one reason why she's going to assume that they are the same, because she, I think, is assuming they use similar tactics, because they have to appeal to public opinion. You have to appeal to public support for your demands, whether you be environmental activist or a gay rights activist or a farmers union or a semiconductor company, whatever. You need to appeal to the public to support you. And you need to do that while you are pressuring politicians and government officials to support you, with the claim that if they don't support your demands, then the public is going to vote against them in the next elections, along with the efforts of these companies to persuade the public that the government is supporting them or not supporting them, and therefore threatening fundamentally important values to the well-being of our people and our communities. So Sauer critiques the civil society organization's discourse distinction that there's somehow a difference between social movements that appeal for normally good morally good goods, moral changes, and material selfish changes. But in reality, the behavior of those two types of actors is very similar for the reasons I've described. Both frame their interests in terms of the common good, right? In terms of appealing to the well-being of society, in terms of getting the most benefit of all of the resources in society. I mean, this is commonly said today, right? That we need to have better maternity leave and childcare policies so that we can exploit fully the human resources of women in our society, so they can go to work and contribute to the economic development of the country. But they can't if they have to stay home to watch the children. So yeah, it costs some money to provide for daycare for the children, but the overall benefits are much outweigh the immediate cost of providing for daycare and for children, maternity leave, and good schools where the children can be taken care of while the mom or the mother or the caregiver, whoever that is able to go to work. This is a big challenge, for example, in Korea and Japan as well, right? That Japan needs to do more to make it easier for women to go to work. Whereas you can't always rely anymore on your grandparents to provide free health daycare for the children. So they all target these interest groups and social movements. They all target the European institutions. Since this is a focus of the class, the European Council and the Council of Ministers, the European Parliament, and the European Commission. I think we covered a bit about this at the last class, right? They engage in action repertoires, again, in their appeals to the public for support, like in play acting and in stage on an act with a way of acting and protesting and to get attention from the media and from the public to pay attention to them, and organizational restructuring. So we already covered a lot of this at the last class. Maybe to get to this point, they make the point that interest groups and social movements are all organizations. They may have formal and informal members. That's the claim made in much of Europe and in the United States as well, that, yeah, most workers not join trade unions. We know this, but we also know that really these organized trade unions, they really do speak for the interests of labor in America, or the interest of labor in France, or the interests of labor in Italy, even if most Italian workers and most French workers do not belong to formal trade unions. So the extent to which they do have, of course, formal membership will be an indicator of how strong they really are. I mean, back when I was born, at least a third of American workers belonged to trade unions. At least 1/3 of them did. Out of all workers, including small companies, big companies, that's a lot. Now it's under 10% in the United States, and I think that's a similar number in France. So what about Europeanization of interests and strategies? Let me highlight some of the research the importance of context in explaining the behavior of society, this is a framework that, if you go further in the study of administration and management, like in business administration, you're going to encounter this theory from Abraham Maslow. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a theory that he put forth in the 1940s. So it's quite old, but it's quite common. And basically it highlights how human beings have, at least in terms of groups, you can always find individuals who differ, but human beings have fundamental hierarchy of needs that they focus on satisfying these needs. And once one set of needs is satisfied, they move on to the next set of needs. So here is the Wikipedia entry, just to show you there's a Wikipedia entry, and they give you this hierarchy. That down here are the most basic needs, like safety needs, the need to believe that I'm not in dire threat of dying, being killed by an enemy. Safety. And once I have my safety needs satisfied, like I take for granted that when I wake up in the morning here in Korea, I don't have to worry about starving to death. I don't have to worry about somebody attacking me and killing me. I just take for granted that my needs for safety are taken care of. And once that need is satisfied, then human beings will forget about this need because it's satisfied, and then their behavior will then focus on satisfying these needs. The need for belonging, self-esteem. That after I take for granted that I'm going to fundamentally, physiologically survive, I want to belong to a group and I want to satisfy my personal relationships. I want to be around people I like and people who like me, who, and I can feel like there are people in this world who care about me. Then when I take that for granted, like I have a stable family background, I then might focus upon my needs to gain status and respect in society more broadly, esteem needs. And once I work and act and fulfill my perceived abilities and develop them fully, I then might become, once I become aware of who I am and what my capabilities are, then I might start focusing upon my own individuality. And that means pursuing my own interests, my own intellectual interests, pursuing my own aesthetic, beauty needs, and then self-actualization means accepting myself, liking myself, understanding myself in order to like myself, in order to develop myself fully in terms of my uniqueness. And so the point I want to make is that obviously today in 2022, maybe not today in Ukraine, but in the rest of most of Europe, these needs are taken for granted, right? Everybody in Europe in 2022, they know that they will have a place to live, that they, if they're not refugees, I should say, that they have access to healthcare. They're not going to worry about having to find food. They're not going to starve. And as people become more well-educated in these societies, remember, like I said, only in 1970 in the United States did half of the adult population have a high school diploma. They become more aware of the world and their ability to think about the world and develop their own intellectual frameworks, theoretical intellectual frameworks for understanding the world. This is a reflection of the impact of prosperity, development, and the welfare state. Welfare state policies like Social Security, medical care, universal medical care, and housing, and education. And collectively, that means more and more of Germany, more and more of France, more and more of Italy have moved towards satisfying these needs. And these needs they're often called many things, including post-material needs. And new social movements that emerged in North America and Europe in the 1960s and 70s reflect the impact of these needs. Not only these needs, these needs are still present. If you're concerned about being drafted and sent to go fight in Vietnam, yeah, you're going to be concerned about your safety needs, sure. And that certainly was a big source of the engine or for the energy for a lot of these social movements in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, right? But it was also a reflection of the fact that people become more educated, more prosperous, more secure, and more willing to be tolerant of other people who do not fit the stereotype of what I think of the perfect Italian or the perfect German or the perfect Frenchman, that particularly the traditional perfect German that, let's say, the Nazis promoted in Hitlerian Germany. What is a good German? A good German is an Aryan. And what's an Aryan? Well, Hitler will tell you what an Aryan is. And so I think I have I have too many files to open up here, so I lose track of some of these things. But that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you, as I said, if you go further in, what happened to that? I thought I had to. If you go further yeah, there it is. If you go further in the study of administration, you would learn, of course, about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because you as a manager in an organization, whether it be a business or a non-governmental organization, a nonprofit, you need to manage people. And the point I want to make here is that if you want to manage people, you want to get the most out of the people that work for your organization. You want to use most of their potential. You want to, and that means you want them to be enthusiastic and grateful to work for you in your company. So that means you have to know what their needs are. What do they want out of life? I mean, to say, well, they just want a paycheck. You don't want to work for the paycheck? Well, get out of here. That's a very basic drive. But if you really want to have an effective business corporation, you need to think about the other needs of people. You need to think about other needs that go beyond the paycheck, particularly if it's easy for people, relatively speaking, to find jobs where they can get a paycheck. They can quit and go work somewhere else. So you want to create an environment in the business organization where people are enthusiastic about working there because you're satisfying these other needs that they're also trying to satisfy. Right? And so, and that means you also have to reflect the changes going on in society. So for example, here is a news report that has just come out. And I thought I put it in the other, well, I'm thinking about the methodology class. I got to teach next class. And of course, all of these issues come together. Here's a New York Times report about how there's been a backlash against corporations focusing their economic behavior on what's called ESG. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance principles. So, and this is, of course, Vice President Mike Pence was Donald Trump's vice president, and he's going to maybe run for president in a few years in 2024. And he's speaking at a company convention for energy production in Texas, where they have lots of oil and gas. He said that corporations should not be focusing on satisfying environmental, social, and governance principles. ESG is the term. And of course, these corporations are under pressure from both their employees and increasingly from their stockholders, the people that own stock in the company, share in the companies, to take into consideration the impact of their economic activity as businesses, as companies, on these economic, social, and governance issues, broadly understood to be human rights concerns. So until recently, well, not recently, but when, through the 1970s, there was this focus upon companies should only focus on making profits. And this, of course, was articulated by people like Milton Friedman, right? That Milton Friedman, a famous economist, focused on profits and said that companies should only focus on maximizing the profits of their shareholders. These other concerns about environment and injustice and racial injustice, that's all really, really, really important, but that's not the responsibility of companies to deal with that. That's the responsibility of governments. And there has been a reaction against this, that some notable names are pushing back as businesses get increasingly tangled up in cultural and political fights, and as the federal government builds ESG principles into regulation. So US government is starting to institute laws and policies to, in the regulatory policies of government agencies towards a vast array of different kinds of corporations, to make them act in accordance or encourage them to act in accordance with broader human rights considerations, including environmental and economic and social justice considerations. It says here, a new financial firm, Strive, was started by Vivek Ramaswamy, the author of Woke Incorporated, and backed by the billionaire investors Peter Thiel and Bill Ackman, has a similar mission. It will be to urge companies not to get involved in social, political, and environmental issues. So why have they been getting involved in social, political, and environmental issues? Why have they been getting involved? Well, they've been getting involved because their shareholders and their employees have been pushing them to get involved. Because shareholders and employees today are different from the way they used to be 100 years ago. Notably, even BlackRock, an unspoken leader in sustainable investing, is stepping back, saying in a memo on Tuesday that it's supporting fewer shareholder proposals on climate disclosures This proxy season didn't last because too many are constraining and prescriptive. The Securities and Exchange Commission is feeling the pressure this week. The agency extended the public comment period on proposed new climate disclosure rules without explanation. The move came days after Republicans on the House Financial Service Committee demanded a hearing with the commissioners, accusing the SEC of overreach and of relying on short and overlapping comment periods to push a scorched earth rulemaking agenda. Supporters of the climate proposal want action. The climate's chairman argues that many companies long measured their exposure to climate risk only with no overarching regime to make the metrics meaningful. So in other words, again, these companies are responding to the emerging demands of their shareholders and employees. In the Europe, go back to the European Union, in terms of its strategy for promoting support among its European citizens, it has been really advancing this notion that the European Union, what is the European all about? The European's all about economic and social and governance issues. That's what the European Union is all about. And that's why you and me should love the European Union, because the European Union creates laws and policies that encourage corporations to focus more than just on their immediate profitability every 3 months in their quarterly reports, to focus on broader issues like the well-being of the planet due to climate change in their economic planning and strategy and activity. So Europeanization of interests and strategies. Oh, let me go back to the study of these new kinds of deals that go beyond immediate security, economic, material benefits. It's called post-materialism, right? Post-materialism is the transformation of individual values from materialist, physical, economic to new individual values of autonomy and self-expression. In other words, self-realization in Maslow's terms. Self-realization. Ronald Inglehart, he was the political scientist at the University of Michigan who built his whole career on studying post-materialism and post-material values. And particularly, he was focusing on the emergence of these new left social movements that have had a big impact in North America, in Europe, and increasingly in places like Korea and Japan. I mean, we don't have any Korean students in the class, but you know that this last election in Korea, a big issue was the impact of feminism and the claim among the right-wing voters, many right-wing voters in Korea, that feminists and feminism has had too much influence in Korean society at the expense of men. So, and of course, highlighting this emergence of these post-material values in the relatively stable and prosperous world of North America and Europe. And there used to be, go back here, relatively recently. I think, oh, it doesn't have a diagram. There used to be a diagram here that I used to, yeah, he died recently. He would do the World Value Survey, trying to look at discover the growing impact of these post-material values on people's political behavior, including their involvement in social movements. But there used to be a chart here, which I don't see anymore. Okay, well, find that some other time. So let's go back then to Europeanization. So Europeanization really wants to encourage economic and social and governance issues as being the motivator for European integration, particularly trying to generate more and more support among Europeans, particularly young Europeans, to really like Europe. But to get to the reality of this process of Europeanization, the authors highlight that whether or not national interest groups Europeanize their lobbying strategies depends upon the resources available to these non-state actors, along with their domestic institutional context. So, yeah, so I think we covered a bit of this later, previously. And, but one of the contexts of European integration, one of the, is this growing level of security within these societies as a consequence of European integration. So if you go back to the, what did I do with it? If you go back to the chart here that I had. That, you know, people form states and nation states because they want to satisfy their needs. Functionally speaking, people form in groups versus out groups because they're trying to satisfy their basic and more advanced needs. And nationalism tends to associate with these needs, right? Nationalism tends to associate with these needs, right? To survive, to thrive, to feel good about yourself as a Korean or as a Ukrainian or as a Bulgarian, and by Bulgarian self-determination, Korean self-determination against the Japanese Empire, or Ukraine self-determination against Russian domination. Nationalism tends to associate with these needs. Nationalism is a compensatory phenomenon that associates with these needs, with the effort to satisfy these needs. And of course, people have multiple identities. I think we picked upon me at a previous class, right? I asked you to describe who I am, and we said, well, I'm a man, I'm a professor, I'm an American, I'm an Italian, I'm white, I'm male, I'm bald, you can go on and on and on, describe who I am in terms of groups that I belong to, or that you think I belong to. Some of those groups will be more important to me than others. I mean, the fact that I'm from Ohio doesn't really have much impact on my behavior. It has a little impact on my behavior, but in terms of my willingness to sacrifice for the self-determination of Ohio, it's pretty low. But if I'm your typical American, or your typical Ukrainian, or your typical Russian, I probably will sacrifice quite a bit for the self-determination of my nation when it's under threat, serious threat from an enemy, whether it be Russia, or whether it be Germany, or whether it be France, or whether it be Japan, or whether it be China, etc. And of course, we have some identities are more important to me than others. So you might be proud of being British, even if you're from Scotland, even though the English have stereotypes of the Scottish people as being, heavy drinkers and kind of country bumpkins, being backward, rural type people. But if you're little Scotland, country of only 4 or 5 million people, on an island dominated by English with 55 million people, and you speak English, although you might speak English as a Scottish person with some slight accent that people make fun of and laugh at, you accept it and tolerate it because you want to satisfy your needs, right? To get a job and have a secure life, and from the threatening French or from the threatening Germans or whomever is threatening your country in the 19th or 20th centuries. And so and it's not so bad to be part of the British Empire, right? Because if you're part of the British Empire, you can feel esteem and look at this amazing British Empire occupying 20% of the world's landmass. Southern Asia, Australia, Canada, much of Africa, 20% of the world under British control. It's great being British. Rule Britannia. And then, of course, Britain loses the empire. Britain loses its empire in the 20th century and becomes, relatively speaking, economically not so healthy, not doing so well in the middle of the 20th century. And Britain joins the European Union. And it becomes inconceivable within the European Union to think about war ever emerging again between Germany and Britain and France. And this isn't ever a concern you have to seriously worry about as a Scottish person living in Scotland. So you might think, hey, and guess what? We discovered all of this oil right off our coast, the coast of Scotland in the North Sea. Oil and gas, really valuable. You know what? We don't need to be part of the United Kingdom anymore in order to be prosperous and safe, because we can join the European Union and use the euro and be part of the European common market as a member state, the state of Scotland. And this has been the impact also on Catalonia in Spain, that we don't need Spain because of European integration. We don't have to worry about being invaded and conquered by outside powers. That's not going to happen anymore. And so all of the indignities and costs that we have to pay to be part of the United Kingdom, we don't have to pay that anymore, because we can be secure and prosperous, even more prosperous, by being our own independent country. So that's been one impact of European integration, that people's, as these needs are really taken for granted, because as I said in the literature, the point is made repeatedly, war between France and Germany is now supposedly inconceivable. It's inconceivable to imagine war between Germany and France and anybody else in the European Union. It's inconceivable is the term they use. Okay, so we don't need to be part of the United Kingdom anymore, because we can get a better life for ourselves, including esteem for being Scottish, and in terms of understanding our needs and expressing who we are fully by having our own Scottish state, or our own Catalonia, independent, free Catalonia, free from these Spanish people that exploit us hardworking Catalonians having to work hard and have our hardworking profits taken away by those lazy Spaniards in Madrid who, what do they describe? The Catalonia is like a cow. Spain is like a cow, right? That the udder, that the mouth of the cow is in Catalonia, in Barcelona, and the udder, where all the fruits of the hard work of Catalonian business people are taxed and taken from these lazy Spaniards to finance their lifestyle by taxing the industrious, hardworking Catalonians. It's not very nice. I know it's not very nice, but this is how they talk. And European integration has made these dreams, these images, these social movements, including nationalist social movements, Scottish nationalism, Catalonian nationalism, even Irish nationalism, more feasible through the liberal economic and social and justice governance framework of the European Union. And so this has been a big concern for the European Union, that if it's seen as a means by which to break up states, to fracture Spain, for example, then this may endanger the European integration project if Spanish nationalists in Madrid think the European Union is a vehicle for breaking up Spain. So it's a very sensitive tightrope that the European Union has to walk. The European Union insists it will not consider and deal with Catalonian nationalists trying to use the European Parliament and the European institutions to Europeanize their nationalist self-determination social movement for Catalonia, because they don't want, in part because they don't want to generate a harsh backlash among Spanish nationalists, represented by people like who support the Conservative Party in Spain. Back to the so yeah, I think I had all sorts of notes here I was going to show you. Yeah, so yeah, people have different degrees of self-identification with different in-groups. Like I said, how much do I self-identify with Ohio? Well, maybe I will sacrifice some peace of mind for Ohio. I like Ohio. I love Ohio State. I love Ohio State football. I love the Ohio State University. I love Ohio football teams, the Cleveland Browns and so on. But how much am I going to sacrifice for the well-being and autonomy and self-determination of Ohio? Nothing, probably, very little. I might give a little money, donate a little bit of money to my university because my university, Ohio State University, a public university, has done so much for me. And that's about the extent of my self-identification with Ohio. If there's a conflict between Ohio and America or Ohio and other actors, I will sacrifice some peace of mind about Ohio being treated unfairly. Or if I'm, let us say, well, for example, many of these Ukrainians living in Britain and in European Union countries, thousands have been going back to Ukraine, giving up their jobs, their lives to fight for Ukraine, and risking their lives to fight as soldiers in Ukraine against the invading Russian army. That tells you they are Ukrainian nationalists, right? First intensity identifies with their nation because they're willing to sacrifice their career, give up their careers working however they are in their country to go and fight for Ukraine and risk their life to do that. And many other people, like for example, I think we have one of our students is from Switzerland. When I was in American University in Bulgaria, the wars in the Balkans were underway. And in 1999, Kosovo broke away through a violent war from Serbia. And the Kosovo Liberation Army was fighting the big Serbian military that was occupying Kosovo. And the reports I remember reading was that there was a large Albanian community in Switzerland, that the diaspora of Albanians includes many working and living in Switzerland, and that many people in Europe, including in Switzerland, were sending money back to support the Kosovo Liberation Army. So people sacrifice some wealth, and also even their wealth to the extent it affects their lifestyle, like sending back a lot of money that they have been making in Switzerland to help the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army. Or you see this with Jewish nationalists in the United States. The people self-identify intensely with America, but they also self-identify intensely with Israel. And so many Jewish Americans are here, right? In terms of being willing to sacrifice wealth to the point it affects their lifestyle to support their home country. And so we're getting further measures about just how intense Ukrainian nationalism is. And clearly the claim is in the media that Putin and Russia grossly underestimated the intensity of Ukrainian identity. And that's typically a danger among nationalists like Russian authoritarian populist regimes. They stereotype the way Hitler did or the way Putin did towards Ukraine. And we're seeing thousands and thousands of Ukrainians and others going to Ukraine to fight and kill and maybe die to defend Ukraine, as well as lots of money being sent back as well. So, yeah, that summarizes these points here. So, but back to European integration and the impact of Europeanization, that aside from the focus on nationalism, which is really important, so let's focus on state and interest group relations. So this study, or this focus on the European Union, looks at how these different interest groups, including social movements, use the European Union's multi-level system of governance, including the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European focus on promoting local governments, including regional governments, as part of the European Union policymaking process. That's why it's called multi-level system of governance, because it involves not just the national government, but also supranational European institutions and local institutions, regional governments as well. That this has provided opportunities for social movement actors and interest group actors to pursue their objectives in a more sophisticated and effective manner. The pluralist perspective means focusing on the competing efforts at influence by different interest groups to pressure government officials to give them what they want. Neo-corporatist perspectives, the theoretical literature in neo-corporatism focuses upon the government actors, the government institutions themselves providing the leadership and determining the outcome of the policymaking process. This tends to focus upon the interest groups themselves as being sort of like, the politics is like a game of pool, billiards, right? That the interest groups are these balls hitting into each other, and the outcome of all this interaction, these interest groups pressuring and competing with each other within the framework of the government, that the government basically acts like a big cash register, calculator, adding and subtracting all the conflicting pressures of these different groups, depending upon their relative political weight and influence, which depends upon their money, their size, their intensity of motivation, their intensity of engagement. And you add up all of these conflicting pressures and you sum them up like you would a physics problem. force equals mass times, what does pluralism emphasize? Some of you have taken physics, right? You had to sum the vectors, in physics school, in physics class. So you have the y vector and the x vector, and then you have this interest group. Let's say the issue is environmental policy. So the steel manufacturers have one position, and they're very influential. The environmentalist interest groups have their own position, but they're even more intensely motivated than the steel manufacturers on this particular issue. So their vector is even stronger. You have the interests of the workers who are affected by environmental policy and its impact on manufacturers, and you have the impact of the government agencies that are represented by the government here as well. And you sum all of these vectors up according to force equals what? Mass times acceleration, and you get a vector that sums up the impact. And the one single vector that you get from adding up these vectors, this is policy. This is the pluralist model, right? The pluralist model of policy making. The government really doesn't play an independent, autonomous role. Or if it does, it's only one social movement one interest group actor in this competitive process. But the neo-corporatist perspective focuses more upon governments providing leadership. And it emphasizes that there's a hierarchy among state and non-state actors. And some scholars have combined the pluralist and the corporatist system of policy making to come up with the European system of governments as being a form of elite pluralism. Yeah, this is maybe true, but you can't explain the actions of these interest groups without really focusing mostly on the activities of their leaders. That the European policymaking process is really complicated and multi-level, and the people that benefit, that know how to utilize this system, are the people that are embedded in the system. So it's a form of elite pluralism. And that pretty much corresponds with the point that we made earlier, that the European Union is really an elite-driven process, right? It really is an elite-driven project. And some interest groups have more biased access to European institutions than others. But again, to qualify this, we've been seeing the power of nationalism, and maybe that's one critically important factor to make about nationalism. When a country is a nation state, when an actor is a nation state, and it perceives itself collectively as experiencing a crisis, that when nationalist behavior emerges, interest group model doesn't really apply. I mean, those of us who thought, if we're pluralists who believe, what counts? Material interest, money, or for Marxists, and focus upon class interest, class drives, the power of the rich elite bourgeoisie to control the rest of the society through their control over the media, not to mention the means of production. and their influence over the government and the education system to create a prevailing view about how the status quo is natural and right and proper and represents the public good rather than the good of a particular group of people. How do you explain Brexit? I mean, big British companies were against Britain leaving the European Union. These big British banks, big British corporations, they didn't want to leave the European Union, and they have lots and lots of money. So if you're a Marxist or a pluralist, how can you explain that? Britain's leaving the European Union. And I think that it's another case that shows that money doesn't really ultimately drive the political behavior of a political system in a nation during a time of crisis. I mean, look at the economic sacrifices that the Russians are now making for their tragic intervention in Ukraine. The Russian economy is losing vast amounts of wealth. Russian business people are being shut out from international trade and business, where they moved hundreds of billions of dollars of euros and dollars out of the country for their own benefit. They don't want to lose all of those benefits, all that resources, all that money. So those of you who think politics is all about this explains, I don't think you can explain the much of political reality in terms of this. These rich oligarchs, capitalists in Russia are not dominating policymaking in Russia right now. And they didn't dominate it when Britain decided to leave the European Union. But back to the notes. Others have argued that examples of both pluralism and neocorporatism can be located at the European Union level. That's sure. I mean, probably not surprising. And so the focus of this literature then shifted to the policy level and typologizing state level interest intermediation. So there's a way by which the Italian state tries to intermediate between European interests and needs and Italian interests and needs. And that reflects, guess what? Italian history, Italian characteristics, Italy's Italy's uniqueness, the uniqueness of the Italian state. There's an Italian way of intermediating between Europe and Italian interests, like there's a French way, like there's a German way. But at the same time, social movements no longer focused only on the states themselves in terms of trying to organize themselves to pressure the authorities to get what they want. If they can use the European Union institutions, they do, of course. And of course, it gets more complicated because how these different interest groups and social movements relate to their societies also varies across the different policy sectors. You know, policy sectors includes economic sectors, but what about, you know, health, abortion, medical care, or controversial, sensitive topics, right? Some areas might be highly pluralistic, like environmental policy. Other policy areas might display corporatist tendencies, like agriculture. And that, again, reflects this belief that, you know, European countries must maintain some degree of food security capabilities. I mean, gosh, I keep making these statements, and I think about what happened with Ukraine and Russia, and, you know, Russia and Ukraine were such an important part of the agricultural supply for the whole world, and that's being shut off or obstructed, right? What I hear yesterday was the director of the World Food Program, David Beasley, the former governor of South Carolina, said Ukraine has 20 billion tons, maybe more, 20 million tons of wheat and grain it can't ship out of the country. And that is an incredibly important part of the world food supply. And so why do I mention that? Because someone who defends the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, for all these years, This common agricultural policy of the European Union was being attacked as unfair, inefficient, subsidizing inefficient French, Italian, and Greek farmers who can't compete with American and Canadian farmers to protect them. And the Europeans come up with all sorts of excuses about how, well, we have to subsidize our farmers because we might need to have that farming capability in case there's a world crisis. And people used to laugh and say, that's outdated. We've moved beyond those concerns about not being able to feed ourselves. We have a world agricultural economy. And now we have this crisis in Ukraine, in Russia. And I can bet, you can be certain that the defenders of the common agricultural policy are saying, I told you so. I told you so. We were right. The common agricultural policy of the European Union was attacked and mocked by the Americans, by the Canadians, by the Indians. India was saying, we're not going to open up our agricultural markets for imports from the rest of the world until the Europeans get rid of their obstructions to agricultural imports into the European Union. In some strongly statist policy areas, especially in Britain, France, and Greece, the state actor representatives have traditionally provided little access or influence to interest groups in the formulation of policy, like they more centralized and more controlled, supposedly. But however, in the implementation of policy, they have been more willing to accommodate these interest groups. The state actor representatives have allowed exceptions to rules at times, or allowed interest groups to be self-governing by limiting the rules. That depends upon the state of the member state of the European Union. In the European Union multi-level governance framework, where neo-corporatist policy-making structures prevail, interest groups have similar difficulties in adapting. This term neo-corporatist, neo means new and improved, right? Neo means it's new and better than the previous form. Neoliberalism, neo-corporatism. Corporatism was a term that was first used to describe authoritarian governments dominating societies in Europe in the early part of the 20th century, like under fascism in Spain and Italy. So this is new and improved corporatism. The state continues to provide leadership, and the state is supreme in the form of its government, but it relies upon benign leadership skills and capabilities to organize society overall, and it is trusted. The state is trusted in the form of the bureaucrats and the agencies by both labor and industry, as well as the finance and other forms of leadership, of economic activity. In the form of the representatives, they defer to the government leaders, and they trust the government leaders to organize business strategy for national development. And you see it here in South Korea. Like South Korea is an excellent example of a neo-corporatist state. And this is evidence, for example, in the fact that these corporations, these industries, they will share private confidential information with these government actors in these societies because they trust them. And typically it's these societies that have a strong state, monarchical, aristocratic tradition. Like in Austria, like in Sweden, like in Germany to some extent, like in France, even if they no longer have a king, right? That the state in the form of the government is expected to provide leadership. And it doesn't need to use threat or fear of coercion and terror to control people, the way the fascists did. So they are more effective to the extent that the member state governments establish European Union coordinating structures that purposefully include major interest groups. So when Sweden or Austria is dealing with Swedish business people or Austrian business people in unions, the Swedish government and the Austrian government, and the Swedish authorities and the Austrian authorities more generally, they organize their societies in such a way that they are more able to articulate what Sweden and Austria need with regard to the European Union and what they want with regard to the European Union. So that means they create more effective structures within the government for coordinating, for aggregating and articulating these different demands and needs of their economies and societies. In those policy areas in which pluralist policy-making approaches are allowed to prevail, where they allow them to prevail, like particularly for example, economic policy, the interest groups have adapted rapidly to become the main interlocutors, as in the Netherlands. So the interest groups themselves, not the government officials, but the interest groups themselves, have established organizations to represent, Netherlands business needs in interacting with the European Union institutions. Okay, I'm going to shut down the computer and open up my laptop now. So stand by.